Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of my video blog series. I'm your host Nick Renard and today we are going to talk about determining when it is appropriate to shift your AdWords strategy. A lot of people have asked me questions in the past about when is a time to determine whether or not a campaign is successful or whether or not it's failing. There's a lot of variables that go into that equation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to review some of the most important variables that I think you should be keeping an eye on in terms of campaign performance, and also on the inverse side of things, also go over some variables that are slightly overrated, or maybe you should take with a little bit of a grain of salt next time you look at them or analyze them for your campaigns. So let's get started. The first and foremost, most important thing when it comes to analyzing the performance of a campaign is conversion data. This may seem obvious if you take the examples here. If you have campaign 1 that has 50 conversions, campaign 2 has 25 conversions, campaign 3 has 10 conversions, it's easy to say, just looking at conversion data, that the one with 50 conversions would be quote-unquote better. One thing that is important when you're analyzing your conversions is how many conversions are you getting per dollar that you spend. So the most important piece of data isn't just total conversions, but rather cost per conversion. It's important to look at both your cost and your conversion, which are both variables to determine your cost per conversion. But in this example, you can see that in the campaign number 1 and 2, one of them spent $2,000, one of them spent $1,000, and they both have a total cost per conversion of $40, which may or may not be good. But if you look at campaign number 3, it has the least amount of conversions and least amount of spend, but the rate of return that you're getting on it is actually significantly better than the first two campaigns. So rather than just looking at total conversions, you always want to make sure that you keep an eye on a variable that we deem as much more important, is cost per conversion, because it's more telltale of the overall performance of those campaigns. At the bottom here, you'll see a note that says make sure your conversion tracking is working. Again, this might seem obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a campaign where somebody has been griping about the lack of a performance, and then you notice that one of their maybe a remarketing code or something fell off of their website at some point that caused their conversions to not report properly. So always double check that your conversion data is working. With my accounts, I check at least once a week to make sure that my conversions are still recording. And if I see that for whatever reason they're not coming through for a certain amount of time, then I always go back and double check the coding on the site to make sure everything is there working properly, so that way we know that the data that we're analyzing is accurate. Next variable here is cost per click data. Cost per click by itself isn't a telltale sign of whether or not a campaign is performing well or not, but cost per click is important because sometimes when you're going between the search network and the display network, or between one campaign to another campaign, or one keyword to another keyword, the prices can vary quite a bit. I've seen clicks on the search network go up to $60 or $70 just for one click, and I've seen them go as low as 5 cents on the display network. So you have a wide range there. Saying that a click that costs $60 is better or worse than a click that costs 5 cents, better or worse wouldn't be the words that I would use to describe it. Because if the click that costs $60 has a 20% conversion rate, but your click that costs 5 cents never converts at all, then I would still rather take the expensive clicks that eventually will convert. So again, conversion data is more important, but the reason that we look at cost per click data is because most people are given a limited amount of budget for their advertising campaign. So some people say, I can only spend $6,000 a month on pay-per-click, or in this example you see $1,000 a month is the budget for these examples. And you can see that in the 3 example campaigns I have here, the search campaign, the remarketing campaign, the display select campaign, that each one of them has a different cost per click, and you can see that the estimated amount of traffic or clicks that you're going to get in a month is drastically different depending on the cost per click between those campaigns. The reason that this is important is because oftentimes when you have that limited budget, it's impossible to test all of those campaigns viably at once because it's just too expensive. Because you're going to be spreading yourself too thin. I mean, if you have $1,000 a month, 100 clicks from there, you can see that it's going to fulfill the whole entire budget. My recommendation in terms of your cost per click is to test out campaigns that have smaller cost per clicks to begin with. Not because a smaller cost per click is necessarily better than a higher cost per click, but you'll accumulate data faster, which when you have more data to look at, it's easier to determine the performance of that campaign. If you're trying to analyze the performance of a campaign that has a really high cost per click, then the amount of data points that you're going to have to look at is going to be significantly smaller. So it's better to start small. If you notice that it's doing poorly, or maybe you notice that you could shave some of the bad spend off and then make it convert well. That at that point is when you should start working on testing out newer campaigns with higher cost per clicks. Because the ones with lower cost per clicks are a little bit easier and faster to test to begin with. Impression share is one of the most important variables that you can keep your eye on. The definition of impression share is it's the percentage of time that your ads show on Google, and the way that they figure that out is they divide the amount of times that your ads could have shown on Google by the amount of times that your ads actually showed on Google, or maybe I have the numerator and denominator there. But they divide them and they get a percentage of how often your ads actually appeared on Google. Impression share often worries people right off when they see the percentage, like they see that their impression share is at 30% or 50% or 70%, and the first question that always comes out of their mouth is, why aren't we showing 100% of the time? The truth is that it's extremely inefficient to show 100% of the time, because as your impression share starts climbing from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, all the way up to 100%, the cost per clicks keeps going up and up and up, because you have to bid more competitively against more people to show in those top positions. Eventually you get to a point of diminishing returns where the cost per click is so high that the rate of return that you're getting on those clicks is no longer worth it anymore. So you'll see it in the notes at the bottom here that it says healthy total impression share of 50 to 75%. That's a really rough estimate. There are campaigns that have only 15% impression share and perform beautifully, but anything past that is like, the cost per click just for whatever reason skyrockets at that point. But generally speaking, if your total impression share for a campaign lands anywhere between 50 to 75%, that's about the point where if it's anything less than 50%, then you can probably up the bids a little bit and still get the same return that you're getting currently on those campaigns. Maybe a slightly higher cost per click, but not nothing that is going to make it unprofitable. And then once you start getting closer to that 75% range, you're going to start paying like 20 or 30% more for a click to show up in like 0.2 higher on average or something like that, like showing in the first position or the second position. They're both on the first page, so they're both very good. And we've noticed a lot of patterns in the past where it's actually more advantageous to be bidding lower for spots in the second and third position, because those are the spots that convert better, and that the cost per click in the number one slot, sure, it gets clicked on more, but the cost of those clicks is really high, and the conversion rate is still around the same as the other positions. So you can see in these examples here that there are campaigns of with an impression share of 10%, 30%, and 60%. In campaign number one, the total impression share is 10% there, and you can see that 90% of the impression share is being lost to budget. What that means is that the budget is capping out early in the day. So if you have a budget for that campaign of $100 a day, and by the time noon rolls around, you spent that $100, AdWords is going to shut your campaigns off because you told it not to spend anymore. So any impressions that happen after that point, where your campaign shut off, is considered impression share that you lost due to your budget capping out. In the example, the campaign number one in that example, if you see that your total impression share is 10% and that you're losing a bunch to budget, you should definitely lower your bids because there's really no reason to be losing that much impression share and having your campaigns shut off that early in the day. If you lower the cost per click, your ads aren't going to be showing up as much, density wise, but it's going to show longer over the course of the whole entire day. So you're actually going to get more impressions and more clicks because the cost per click is cheaper, so you can fit more clicks within your budget there. In example number two here, or the campaign number two here, you can see that the total impression share is at 30%, and that it's losing a lot of its impression share to rank. There's two reasons that you can lose impression share to rank. One of them is quality scores, and the other one is your bid. The bid is pretty obvious. If you bid higher, you mitigate losing impression share to rank. If you bid $2 and another guy bids $3, he's going to beat you. That's pretty simple. Quality score is a very, very complicated algorithm that we don't actually know. Google releases, the different variables that are within those algorithms, but not the exact numbers and how they weigh and all that stuff. So things like having good ads, having keywords that are relevant to your products, having a good website that they land on is extremely important. Having site link extensions within your campaign, all those kinds of things will help bring up your quality score and help you mitigate losing some of that impression share to rank. So if you see that in the example number two, if you see your total impression share is at 30% and you're losing most of your impression share due to the due to rank at that point, you can increase your bids or do some things within your campaign to maybe optimize the ads a little bit better and bring up that quality score, and you can mitigate some of that and get your impression share up to closer to that 50 to 75% kind of sweet spot range that I have in the notes at the bottom there. The last example there, campaign number three, is if I were looking at the impression share of these three campaigns, I would say that the impression share looks healthiest for number three there, which is why it's highlighted in green. And you can see that it's sitting between that 50 to 75% is good. Impression share loss due to budget, we generally try to keep that between 5 to 20%. The reason is that we actually want to lose a very small amount of our impression share to budget is we want to know that our ads are showing throughout the whole entire day, but they aren't underspending. So what you don't want, the first example is where it caps out at noon, where you spend your full budget by noon and then it shuts off for 12 hours a day. The other example is kind of the opposite of that, where your ads run the whole entire day, and let's say you had $100 allocated to that campaign for that day, but it only spent $80 that budget. If you're only spending 80% of your budget in a case like that, you can increase your bids and get your ads to show a little bit more aggressively and mitigate losing or mitigate not maximizing your budget in that case. So if you're looking, how this is relevant to this blog here is we're talking about shifting money from one campaign to another. If you see that a campaign has really low impression share, for example, in campaign number one or campaign number two, you know that there's more resources you can allocate towards it. However, in campaign number three, that would be a campaign that, to me, it already looks good. I wouldn't want to throw a ton more money at that because that total impression share is going to be capping out pretty soon. So that would be a campaign. It gives you an idea about how much more you can throw at a campaign. And at the very extreme end of that, if you see that your total impression share is at 100% or close to 100%, you know at that point that it doesn't matter if you increase your bids to $1 billion. You're already showing as high as you can show. You're showing for every single keyword that gets triggered. You can't force people to Google your keywords. Yeah, that's why impression share is relevant, because it gives you a bit of an idea of how much budget you can allocate to or from a campaign. All right, the last variable here that I keep an eye on, this is probably the least important one, but it is one that I always check on for my campaigns, is bounce rate. Bounce rate is something that gets pulled from Google Analytics, so make sure that your AdWords and Analytics accounts are linked if you can't see this in the column section of your AdWords account. Bounce rate is the percentage of time that people click on your link and immediately click back. So if they Google, if you're a shoe store and they look up shoes on Google and they click your ad and they don't like what they see and they immediately click back, that's called a bounce. So if you see a bounce rate of, like in the example number 2 there, of 75%, you know that 3/4 of the people who visit your site are immediately clicking back. Those customers, well, obviously they didn't convert because they clicked back, but they're also not very likely to come back because they didn't really show any interest in your product. They spend more time on the site. It shows that they showed more interest. Those customers are more likely to convert, statistically speaking. So in these 3 examples here, campaign number 1, 2, and 3, you can see that ones with a lower bounce rate would be considered to be healthier campaigns. It doesn't necessarily mean that a campaign with a 95% bounce rate is always going to be more successful than a campaign with a 45% bounce rate. But if you are comparing 2 search campaigns and all other variables are equal, then I would definitely go with the campaign that has a lower bounce rate because you know that people are more inclined to spend more time on the site. A lot of people, when you talk to them about bounce rate for the first time, they're amazed that so many people will click back. Like, if you look at a campaign and the bounce rate is 75%, they're like, really? 3/4 of the people just immediately leave the site? The truth is that a healthy bounce rate lands anywhere between about 30 to 70%. The reason I don't say 0 or include anything below 30% is that almost never happens. You'll see some sites also, like brand name keywords, will have bounce rates that are that low, but typically speaking, for any generic term campaign, you're going to see a healthy bounce rate, land anywhere between 30 to 70%. If it goes past 70%, the bounce rate's getting a little bit higher. Another thing to take in consideration when determining what a quote-unquote healthy bounce rate is if you're on the search network or the display network. The search network, that 30%, 30 to 70% is much more applicable to the search network. Display network will have significantly higher bounce rates, and you'll see that a healthy display network bounce rate will be more in like the 80 to 90% range. Just because the traffic density on the display network is so much more dense that you get a lot more customers with a lot cheaper cost per click. So you cycle through people a lot quicker, so they tend to have higher bounce rates. But that kind of gives you an idea of when you look at bounce rate for your campaign where it should be landing, and another variable to analyze for that. All right, and the last thing here I want to talk about is kind of the inverse of where to move campaign variables to look at. Here I want to talk about variables not to look at, or variables to take with a grain of salt here. You'll see at the note here at the bottom it says avoid squirrel stats and stick to variables with more meaning. Squirrel is a term that we use in the AdWords industry as squirrel data is just kind of boring data. It doesn't really mean anything. I mean, it is significant and it has some value to the campaign, but it doesn't have nearly as much meaning as something like cost per conversion has on those campaigns. So a click is a great example. Like, a click is great, but if that click doesn't convert, or if that click costs a ton of money and they don't actually buy anything from the site, then that click is bad. But at the same time, if you have a click and they do convert or they do buy something on your site, then that click is really good. So the point is that you can't determine whether or not a click is good or bad just by looking at how many clicks you have. So the first example here is average position, and a lot like impression share, when people look at their average position and they see it's at like 4 or something relatively low, they panic because they always want to be showing up in the number 1 position. Keep in mind that showing up in the number 1 position isn't always profitable for you, and a lot of the times it's good to show up lower to get that cheaper cost per click and show up in a lower ad rank. But the real reason that I'm not a big fan of average position is I feel that impression share just does a better job of telling the story behind where your ads are landing, and that if you're looking for data that revolves around where your ads are ranking, whether they're first or second or third or fourth or fifth on the page, you should look at impression share, because I think that is a more valuable statistic to look at. I still look at an average position from time to time when I'm making bid changes, so that I know if a keyword is showing up in an average position of 5, I know that I can increase the bids on that keyword by quite a bit before it gets into that top position. Whereas if I see a keyword that's in the average position of like 1.1, example number 1 here, you can't really increase the bids by that much more. I mean, that keyword cannot show much higher than it already is. It's already in the first position the majority of the time. The second example here of overrated variables would be clicks. We already talked about that a little bit, how just looking at the number of clicks it doesn't tell you whether it's good or bad. The one thing I do like about clicks is it tells you how significant the other variables of data that you're looking at is. If you are looking at a campaign that only has 15 clicks versus a campaign that has, like in example number 3, or yeah, just take these two examples. Example number 1 has 30 clicks and example number 3 is 12,000 clicks. You're going to have more statistically significant data in campaign number 3 than you are in campaign number 1. Now, whether or not that data is good or bad is going to be up to the other variables, but that's kind of what clicks tell you in a campaign. But again, they by themselves do not actually tell you anything about the performance of that campaign. Impressions are very similar to clicks. It's just how much your ads show up on Google, but your ads showing up doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually getting customers. So impressions are something that, saying that you have 1,000 impressions or 500,000 impressions, I'm not really impressed or unimpressed by either of those, because my question would be, well, how often are people clicking when those impressions happen, or how often are the people who click on those ads converting? Like, the conversions are more important than some of the more elementary variables like impressions. And the last one here, I actually almost excluded this one from the slide, click-through rate. The reason I almost excluded it is because click-through rate is the most dominant variable within Google's algorithm for determining ad rank. If your click-through rate is higher, they're going to show your ads higher. The reason for that is that Google makes money off of people clicking on their ads. So it's in Google's best interest as a business to be showing ads that have a higher click-through rate because they will make more money. Now, click-through rate is definitely something that you always want to be trying to increase. So a click-through rate of 3% is better than a click-through rate of 2%. So higher is better in this case. But in terms of shifting budget from one campaign to another, which is what this blog is all about, if you have two campaigns where all other variables are equal, except the click-through rate on one is 5% and the click-through rate on the other is 2%, it's not. I'm not going to make a decision to shift my budget from one campaign to another based on the click-through rate of that overall campaign. I'm much more inclined to be looking at the first 5 things that we looked at: conversion data, cost per click data, impression share, and bounce rate. I guess that's only 4 things. But so yeah, click-through rate's kind of the last variable here that, in terms of just determining from one variable whether or not a campaign is performing well, click-through rate doesn't tell you a lot about how it's doing. But again, you always want to be improving it so that you can get better quality scores. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope this gives you a little bit of insight. I recommend, with the variables that I showed you in the beginning, to enable those columns when you're trying to analyze the overall performance of your campaigns. And I will see you guys next time.